Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the East Hampton Library to today's lecture. Today we have Jeffrey Sussman, who will be talking about his book, Big Apple Gangsters, published last year in hardcover, and it did extremely well and is now out in paperback. I'm almost 100% positive that you will enjoy this book. It was very well researched and documented, and it is a lot of fun. And without further ado, I'll turn over this afternoon's talk to Jeffrey Sussman.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. My book, Big Apple Gangsters, is really a history of the mob in the 20th and early part of the 21st century in New York, beginning in 1919, when Arnold Rothstein, who was really considered the founder of organized crime in America, fixed the 1919 World Series. Now, Rothstein was a brilliant man. His tentacles went into just about every industry that you can think of. He came from an upper middle class German Jewish family that was very honorable, and his father, who was known as Abe the Just, would be called upon by city officials to mediate all kinds of disputes between labor and management and in civil court matters. And his son was not interested in that at all. His son was always interested in sort of the demi-monde. And by the time he was 15, he was hanging out in pool halls on the Lower East Side and gambling and learning how to fix sporting events. And as he grew older, he became the owner of a number of very plush gambling casinos in a section of New York that was called the Tenderloin District. And he invested his money in a lot of very legitimate businesses. So he probably owned about 10 square blocks of real estate in New York. He owned life insurance companies, property and casualty insurance companies, banks, stock brokerage companies, but he was always attracted to things that were illegal. And that was his primary interest. And he owned a number of horses, and he would fix horse races. And he would fix the horse races by doing one of two things. Either he would pay all the jockeys to slow down their horses so one particular horse would win, or he would have someone sneak into the stables at night and put sponges in the nostrils of horses that he wanted to lose, because by putting the sponges in the nostrils, the horses wouldn't be able to breathe very well, and it would slow their running pace, and so he then knew who would win the race. In the early part of the 1920s, he met Meyer Lansky at a bar mitzvah in Brooklyn, where they were both guests. And at that time, Meyer was head of a gang in New York called the Bugs and Meyer gang. It was one of the most vicious gangs in the city of New York, and eventually it evolved into what was known as Murder Incorporated. And when Rothstein met Lansky at this event, he was so impressed by Lansky's intelligence and ambition that he decided to mentor him, because Lansky also said that he wanted to be a successful gangster. And Rothstein said, "I'll help you." And Lansky brought along three of his teenage pals, Lucky Luciano, who at that time was known as Salvatore Lucania, Frank Costello, whose real name was Francisco Castiglia, and the Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. And these four men were all mentored by Arnold Rothstein. Now, Rothstein was assassinated in a card game in 1928 in the Park Sheridan Hotel. And he had previously financed the Prohibition operations of these four men, and they were becoming extremely wealthy. They were becoming millionaires in the 1920s, and they all came from dire poverty. So this was head spinning for them. And after Rothstein was assassinated in 1928, these four men took over all of Rothstein's operations. And they continued with a prohibition until Franklin Roosevelt came into power and got rid of prohibition. But these four men started something called the National Crime Syndicate, which spread out over the entire country. And it took gangs from Los Angeles, Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Miami, Boston, Newark, and coalesced them in an organization that was controlled by the National Crime Syndicate. And they formed a commission on which the head of each of these gangs had a seat. Now, it was also very interesting because there are a lot of myths about the mafia and organized crime, especially in movies, that aren't true. And for example, if you see movies about the mafia, it excludes other ethnicities, which wasn't true. Certainly, for example, John Gotti's wife was Jewish, and John Gotti's son mafia. But according to movies like Goodfellas, that doesn't happen. It does happen, and so they set up the National Crime Syndicate Commission, and on that commission were also the heads of the 5 mafia families. And it was Luciano and Meyer Lansky and Siegel who arranged for the murder of the 2 original mafia families in New York that were controlled by a man named Joe the Boss Mazzaria and Salvatore Maranzano. And what was interesting, was kind of funny in a way. Luciano worked for Maranzano and hated him. And Maranzano and Masseria, they only wanted to deal with Sicilians. They wouldn't even deal with Italians that came from other cities. They thought that was outrageous. And Luciano thought this was outrageous, especially since he was partnered with a number of Jewish gangsters. And Maranzano was very anti-Semitic. And when Luciano arranged for him to be killed, he hired Jewish gangsters to do it. He thought this would be very ironic, that he would be assassinated by the Jews whom he hated. And one of them was a gangster named Red Levine, who was a member of Murder Incorporated. And when Red Levine was killing Maranzano, he was wearing a yarmulke. And he's afterwards, Meyer Lansky asked him about this, and he said, well, doesn't mean that I have to ignore my religion. And anyway, they killed them in what was that railroad building at the base of Park Avenue, and Maranzano had an office. Joe Masseria was killed in a restaurant in Island while having lunch with Luciano. Luciano, gunman came in. One of the gunmen in that case. So these men took over organized crime, and they really ran it until their old age, or until they died, or until they were killed. And I would like to skip ahead, because there is one gangster who I find an absolutely fascinating character, Greg Scarpa, who was a member of the Colombo family, and which had started out as the Profaci family. And he started out working for Joseph. And then the family was taken over by a man named Carmine Persico. Carmine Persico went to prison. He put a man named Vicarina in to run the family for him. And Vicarina went to the Mafia Commission and said, I would like to be appointed the official head of this family. And when Persico found out about this, he called Scarpa and he said he wanted Arena killed. Now, Gregory Scarpa was the perfect person for this. He was known as the Grim Reaper. He killed between 80 and 100 people. And what was interesting about him, during this entire time, he was an FBI informant. And the FBI condoned everything that he did. His handler was a man named Lynn Del Vecchio, and Del Vecchio claimed that he only was aware of, burglaries and extortion and nonviolent crimes, but he was totally unaware of Scarpa murdering anybody. In any case, Scarpa was out killing people. It was known as the Colombo War. And Scarpa, working so closely with the FBI, and he was so effective and so outrageous. I don't know if you remember, in the 1964, there were 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner. And there was a movie made about it called Mississippi Burning. Totally untrue. It entirely a fiction. What happened is the FBI paid Gregory Scarpa $100,000 to find out who killed these 3 civil rights workers and to find out where their bodies were buried. And he went down to Mississippi and asked a lot of questions, was talking to a lot of people, and he found out there was one guy who was in the Klan named Lawrence Byrd, who worked at an appliance store. And he thought that this would probably be the weakest link back. So he went into the store and he purchased a television. He asked Byrd to help him carry the television out to his car. And after Byrd put the television on the back seat of the car, Scarpa put a gun to his head and pushed him. He drove him to a deserted army base. Told him what he wanted to know, and Byrd wouldn't tell him anything. So he pistol whipped Byrd and really bloodied him, and Byrd still wouldn't tell. So then he told Byrd to drop his pants. Byrd dropped his pants, and Scarpa pulled out a razor, and he said, "I'm going to count to 3, and if you don't tell me what I want to know, say goodbye to your testicles." And Byrd panicked, and that he wanted. And that's how they found who killed the 3 civil buried. And the FBI was so impressed with this that they then hired him to find out who killed black civil rights worker in a nearby town, and found that out as well. So he became a star for the FBI. An FBI agent I found said that Greg Scarpa is our crown jewels. FBI agent. Now, back in Brooklyn, Greg Scarpa went back to his old ways of killing people and extorting people and doing. Now, I had, when I was writing this book, I interviewed a criminal defense lawyer named Jay Goldberg, who you know. And he was a friend of, and he told me that he and his wife probably had dinner about 15 or 16 times in the city, Greg Scarpa and one of his girlfriends. And he told me that Greg Scarpa was extremely well-read, very, very well-spoken, dressed meticulously. He had 5 houses, including a beautiful apartment on Sutton Place, houses all over the place. And he said what was interesting also is that he had a beautiful manufactured toupee that he wore whenever they had dinner. But whenever he went back to Brooklyn to kill somebody, he always never wanted to mess up the toupee. And Scarpa, he had 4 children by his first wife, 2 children by his mistress, and he married a woman, even though he was already married. He married Miss Israel, 1960, in Las Vegas, even though he was already married. And he was at home. He was under house arrest. Brooklyn, Charles Hines had gotten an indictment, had to stay at home and wear an anklet. And his son Joey came home one day and he said there were mob guys who he was drugs to, and they ripped him off, and they said they would shoot him and kill him. This was too much for Scarpa. Scarpa was really a very devoted father. Scarpa pulled out a gun, and one of them returned fire and shot out Scarpa's left eye. Scarpa drove home, and just as he was coming home, his telephone is ringing, and it's the FBI wanting to know why his beeper is going off. So I just had to run out to the drugstore to pick up her. Fine. Meantime, he's bleeding profusely out of his left eye. So he asked his wife to give him a bottle of whiskey, which he poured into his left eye to clean the wound. And then she drove him to a hospital where they bandaged him up. Now, Greg Scarpa was also but he made one big mistake in his health regimen. He ate aspirins as if this went on for years, and eventually the aspirin dug a hole in his stomach, and he was terrible abdominal bleeding. So he had to go to went to a during the height of the AIDS epidemic. And he told the doctor, when they told him he needed a transfusion, he said he only wanted people he knew to give him blood because he was frightened of getting HIV. And one of the guys in his crew was a weightlifter who had been using steroids, and he'd been using dirty needles, and he was infected. And the guy didn't know he was HIV infected. Scarpa got blood from this guy. Eventually, he sued the hospital, not giving him the right information. The doctor whom he sued, because the doctor he sued was being sued and was facing criminal charges because this doctor had anesthetized two of his male patients and performed oral sex on them while they were anesthetized. So, so Greg Scarpa is in court suing this doctor, and the doctor's there, and the judge says, let me get this right. We have a hitman for the mafia suing a doctor who performed oral sex on two of his patients. He says, am I on the right page here? and he won the case, but they originally were going to give him $2 million. But then the medical malpractice insurance companies wanted to negotiate, and he was dying of AIDS. So he decided to settle for $100,000 from the hospital and $100,000. And he sent one of his crew members down to a Citibank branch on Park Avenue South to pick up the $300,000. And his crew members said to the teller, he said, I want it all in cash. And put it all in this bag. And he said, I'm not going to count it till I get home, but I'll tell you something. If it's $1 short, I'm coming back to get you. Apparently, the bank was terrified of this, but they gave him the $300,000 in cash and left. Eventually, Greg Scarpa decided to a 10-year prison sentence. They would spare his family from any participation they had. And his reason, he said, was that being in a prison hospital and dying there would be no worse than being in a regular hospital and dying there. Year after this, he's one of the really colorful characters in this litany of organized crime figures who controlled much of New York during the 20th century and up until about 2000. And they're still there. You know, a lot of people think the mafia is gone, but it isn't. A lot of defense attorneys and prosecutors and I asked him about what he thinks the situation is with mafia today. This is from Michael Vecchione, who was the former chief of rackets division of the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, and he wrote a very good book called Friends of the Family. He said to me, to paraphrase Mark Twain, the reports of the death of the American mafia are greatly exaggerated. The mob is alive and well. It is as dangerous and profitable as it always has been. In my opinion, what has given the impression to mob observers that the mafia is a thing of the past or a shell of itself is the fact that there are no longer guys like the Teflon Don John Gotti or the Oddfather Vincent Chin Gigante or Sammy the Bull Gravano in the spotlight of the press. These guys were the headline makers, reporters' dreams, and paparazzi followed them wherever they could. However, along with the spotlight came the searing interest of law enforcement, which was not good for business. The mafia of today has learned a lesson from the past publicity, and in many ways has gone back to the old style of flying under the radar. This allows them to do business and make money with little or no interruption. With the exception of an incident here or there that catches some agent's or reporter's eye, the American mafia will likely remain in the shadows and thrive. So on his commission trials, everyone said the mafia was dead and that it had been. Mafia experts don't agree with that. Anyway, that's the story of my book, and I would be very happy to answer any questions that anybody has. And also, if you want to buy a book, let me know. He owed a fellow gambler $300,000, which he hadn't paid. And they were sitting at a card game, and this guy had been after Rothstein for months to pay him. Rothstein was quite stingy. I mean, he never liked to pay his debts. And so this man shot him in the stomach, holding a gun onto the table. And Rothstein made it into the lobby of the hotel. An ambulance took him to the hospital, and he died the following day. You had a second question. I'm sorry, say that?
Yeah, you said Scarfo was involved in finding.
Right.
Why did he want to do this?
He didn't want to. I mean, the FBI paid him $100,000 to do it, and they figured he was so good and so tough that he could resort to extra legal tactics, which the FBI was forbidden from using. And so, I mean, the FBI could not threaten to emasculate someone because he wouldn't give them information. Scarpa, that was nothing.
Jeff, in your opinion, the demise, not the extinction of the mob, was caused by different factors. What do you think they were?
This is Joseph Giannini, by the way, and he has defended members of the Lucchese and the Colombo families. Also an expert in boxing. Was a boxing manager and a very good amateur boxer himself. I think there were a lot of things. You know, one of the things that Jay Goldberg said to me was that, you know, he knew a lot of the people at the beginning. He knew Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and he said these people were like generals. They were brilliant. They could control armies in different fields of operation, and they understood all kinds of things that were going on. And he said by the time you got to the third generation, you were dealing with people who didn't have that mental capacity to control things the way these other people were able to control. And so there was a diminution in the quality of the people who were going into the mob. And also, you know, the original founders of the mob came from very poor families. They were the children of immigrants, whether Jewish or Italian immigrants. And it was a quick and easy way for them to make money. You have people, you know, like Michael Francisi, who went to Hofstra University and didn't have to go into the mob, and it didn't have that kind of hunger that his father and earlier generations had. So they weren't as driven, but they liked the excitement of it. And then there were also the RICO prosecutions. The RICO prosecutions, destroyed a lot of people. One old mob guy I spoke to, he said, when I was a young man, there was a possibility I could go to prison for 5 or 10 years. And I could do that standing on my head. But he said, on a RICO conviction, I could go to jail for 100 years. He said, why would I want to do that? And so that certainly became a deterrent.
We have a few questions from the audience at home. We have Jan, who asks, how long did it take you to write this book, and what is the time frame of all your research done?
Well, actually, I was researching while I was writing. I would research a chapter and write the chapter, and then research the next chapter and write that chapter. And altogether, it took a little over a year.
We have a question from Susan. How much contact with the New York Gangsters was there with the Boardwalk Empire characters? That's the television show. Were there any of the descendants of the New York Gangsters today depicted on that show?
Well, I'm sorry to say I never saw the show. I can't intelligently answer that question. But one of the things that I can say is that many movies and dramas that deal with the mafia get it completely wrong. And foremost amongst them is probably The Godfather, beginning with the fact that prior to The Godfather, the heads of families were not called godfathers. That was an invention of Mario Puzo. And many other things in that movie were pure myth. We love the myth of the gangsters the same way that a lot of people like the myth of the cowboy, and for similar reasons. He seems like he can operate successfully beyond the bounds of the law, and no one can touch him, and he can do what he wants to do and make a lot of money and have all kinds of expensive accoutrements. Makes it seem very seductive. But in truth, it isn't very seductive for a lot of people. There are a lot of, low-level mob guys who live sort of. There are also a lot of them who become millionaires, including, even some soldiers.
We have a question from the audience at home. Just a general, what were some of the resources that you used?
I used newspapers and magazines, which the reference librarian here, Stephen Spataro, helped me to find, which is why I always thank him in the acknowledgments of my book. He is one of the best researchers I've ever encountered. In addition to which, I got to speak to a lot of people, a lot of prosecutors, a lot of criminal defense attorneys, and my friend here, Tony Solano, who was a detective in New York and who surveilled John Gotti and had an interesting story to tell about that, which I included in my book. He was able to put me in touch with a man named Tony Napoli, whose father was Jimmy Knapp, who controlled all the bookmaking on the East Coast of the United States. And Tony Napoli told me some wonderful stories, especially a wonderful one, which is not in this book, which is my next book, which is about Las Vegas, of a time when, I'll just tell it, it's because it's an interesting story. Tony Napoli was his father got him a job as a manager at the Sands Hotel and Casino. And Frank Sinatra used to gamble all the time there. And he never paid markers. He figured, I'm such a celebrity, I bring in so many people, you'll pay me if I win, but I'm not paying you back if I lose. But attitude. And one night he wanted a $50,000 marker, and they wouldn't give it to him. They said, you owe too much money. We're not. And the manager of the Carl And, yeah, it was, yeah, a Jewish guy. And wanted to speak to Carl. And it was 3 o'clock in the morning, and Carl was asleep and didn't want to be disturbed. And Frank Sinatra started ripping phones out of the wall and threatening to kill the security guards. And he went to the room where the telephone operators were in the hotel, and he demanded that they call Carl. And they said, we can't disturb him. So he tried to throw out telephones. They had to call a security guard to protect them. And finally, at 5 o'clock in the morning, they were able to awaken Carl, and he met Sinatra in the Gardenia, which was like the coffee shop and Sinatra was there with his bodyguard, and they were seated at a booth. Sinatra was opposite Carl Cohn, that was his name, and Sinatra and Julie Rizzo were sitting opposite them. And Sinatra's cursing and yelling at him and calling him all sorts of names. Carl said, "The hell with this, I'm getting up, I'm leaving." "What, are you afraid of me?" And Carl said, and then he called Carl a dirty Jew. And Carl grabbed Sinatra by his shirt and knocked out 4 of Frank Sinatra's front teeth. And Sinatra then says to Jilly, "Get him, Jilly, get him." And Jilly said, "I don't want any part of this." And Carl Cohn was a very big guy and a very tough guy and a member of the mob. And so Tony Napoli, his job then to drive Sinatra to an oral surgeon to get his lips sewn up. And he did, and then Sinatra was still so angry, he drove his golf cart through the plate glass window of the Sands, and then flew back to Los Angeles to have his teeth repaired. And while he was in Los Angeles, he called Tony's father, Jimmy Knapp, and he said, "I want to have Carl Cohn killed. Well, look at who's signing your checks. It's Carl," and even though they're big checks, they're checks for $250,000 a week, you're an entertainer. That's all you are. You're an entertainer, and Carl is the one signing your checks. And besides, you can't touch Carl. One of us. Do you know what I mean when I say he's one of us? And that was the end of it. However, Sinatra treated the people in the hotel very, very badly. If someone served him an undercooked hamburger, he would take it and throw it against the wall and arrange to have the waiter and the chef fired. And so people hated him. Average person hated him, not the fans. And so after Carl Cohn knocked out Sinatra's teeth, a poster went up all around Las Vegas with a photograph of Frank Sinatra, and someone blacked out his top front teeth, and under it, it said, "Carl Cohn for mayor." And this is a story that Tony Napoli told me, and I found a corroboration for it. I thought that was a very entertaining story. So he was one of the people that I got to interview.
Question was,
Funny
what
you
are the
should ask,
myths
'cause I
from
made
the
a list of them.
Godfather series?
Okay, one was that the mob doesn't deal in drugs. They always dealt in drugs, but it was at the highest level that they dealt in drugs. They didn't want the soldiers dealing in drugs because it would be easy to flip them. Papas and heads of the families all invested a ton of money in drugs, and one of the biggest investors importing heroin into the United States after he was deported was Luciano. Imported millions and millions of dollars worth of heroin into the United States. And the other thing of bodyguards calling in sick, that's a sure indication that you're about to get killed. And also the mob does not like to kill cops. That's really a no-no. There was in the 1980s, there was a low-level mobster named Rachi who killed an A agent named Everett Hatcher. And the DEA agents, the FBI, New York City police, they started closing down all kinds of mob operations until they could get this guy Faraci. And members of the Bonanno family tracked Faraci down and killed him, and then called the DEA office to say, Faraci's no longer a problem, we got him. In the movie, you would think that Sussman would be easy. And the other thing is that the mob wedding in Godfather, mob weddings are very private, not open to the public, and orders hanging around trying to photograph things on the periphery. They never would have gotten that close. Also, you never saw in The Godfather how they made a living. Family drama, but not a mafia is all about making money, and you never saw how they made money in that. You heard that maybe they had been in the olive oil business a long time ago, and also the New York families really didn't have very much control of Las Vegas. And it made it seem as if there was a character based on Bugsy Siegel who was assassinated for not selling his share, selling his casino, Michael. That never happened. The killing of a character based on Meyer Lansky never happened. The killing of Sonny on the Causeway never happened. I mean, all of these things are just, they're wonderful, wonderfully imagined and very cinematic, but there's no truth to any of it, basically.
We have a few questions from the audience at home. Jan asks, your interest in the New York City Mafia comes from where? What is your fascination?
Well, Tony heard me tell this story on Thursday at a luncheon, so don't mind if I repeat it to you. When I was 13 years old, I was bar mitzvahed, and it was held in the Commodore Hotel, which is now Grand Hyatt Hotel. And my father introduced me to a man I had never met before named Irving. He handed me a $100 bill and shook my arm again. I asked my father who that was. That was his uncle by marriage, who had been a very successful bootlegger, billions of dollars, and had a mansion up. And 1935, Irving was indicted but never tried for the murder of Dutch Schultz. They were competitors in not only for Prohibition, numbers racket. And the next thing that got me interested in the mob is my father owned two dress manufacturing companies, and one factory was in Queens and one factory was in Brooklyn. And I used to work at the Queens factory on Saturday mornings when I was a teacher. Menial things like sweeping up the floor and collecting scraps of garments and picking them up. Cycled. But I also had to carry bolts of cloth up from the basement to the cutter's table where the dress pattern was laid out and pattern. One day I'm coming up the stairs carrying a bolt of cloth, and when I get to the top of the stairs, I hear my father and another man arguing very violently at each other, and the spittle is coming out of my father's mouth, and I saw his fists were clenched like he was ready to punch this man, which was certainly a possibility because my father had been an amateur boxer, and he had a very quick temper, and he was very quick with his fists. And this guy called him a dirty Jew, and my father said, "Get out of here." And the guy then pointed his finger like this at my father's head and pulled a trigger, and he said, "We're going to get you, you son of a..." Left. So I didn't know what this was all about, but in the car driving home afterwards, I asked my father what happened. out. And he said that was a man named Johnny Dio, who was a gangster in New York, ran an illegal trucking company and wanted my father to unionize his workers. And my father's workers voted against unionization because my father was a very generous boss, and they were making more money under my father's plan than they would under this illegal unions plan. Then they wanted my father to use his trucking company. And my father went to see the using, and that man said to him, Bob, I don't want to lose your business, but you're going to have to go with them, because if you don't, they're not only going to kill you, they're going to kill your family. I was in the 8th grade at the time. My parents had taken me out for graduation because I was going. And when we came back from dinner, someone had broken into our house and they wrecked the kitchen. The refrigerator was overturned and the contents were all over the kitchen, the ceiling, or on the stove, on the kitchen table. And we learned that it was a message. This is the beginning. You hire the trucking company or worse is to come. And my father had a cousin, a man named Joe Page, who was a very interesting man. He and his brother Bernie operated an Italian grocery store in Corona, Queens during the Depression. And they would take turns going to law school. They went to St. John's Law School. One would go one semester and the other would go the other semester. And the one who wasn't in law school would run the grocery store. And their customers were all Italian immigrants, and check to paycheck. And often they borrowed money from Joe and his brother. And some of these people, they wanted to buy houses, and houses were very inexpensive in that area of Queens Depression, just $1,000. So they would lend them the money to buy a house, and eventually that led into mortgage company, and then a title insurance company. They became very, very wealthy. They market chains but during this time that they were operating the grocery store, they also got to meet a lot of mob guys who they formed, in some cases, business associations. And in the 1950s, Joe was arrested for burning down a warehouse in the Bronx. And I remember there was a newspaper, Daily Mirror, and Joe was on the front page of the Daily Mirror being led off in handcuffs. And my father paid for his bail, and Joe was disbarred as an attorney as a result of that. He was able to escape conviction somehow. I was not privy to. But he was a very interesting man, and he became a private detective after that. Then he and his brother opened a small airport for small planes during the 1964 World's Fair next to LaGuardia. And eventually he went back to college and he got a PhD and became a professor of clinical psychology at CW Post. But during this time when my father was being forced to take this trucking company, Joe, because he knew these people, was able to negotiate a deal. Johnny Dio and partner, a man named Harry Davidoff. Son, by the way, became deputy mayor when Lindsay was mayor. And what happened, deal was better than was originally offered to my father, but they kept raising the trucking rates year after year. And my father died 2 years later of cancer, and his partner was not as strong a person as my father was in terms of dealing with it. And eventually they started taking pieces of the business. And eventually they took over the whole business. Then they were selling all the dresses that they were making at discounts and not paying for the raw garments that they were getting in to make the dresses. After a year, they could no longer get credit anymore, so they burnt the factory down and collected the insurance money. That was the second thing. Then the final thing is I was divorced from my first wife in 1981, and I was very depressed, and I went to a therapist that was recommended to me. And he was a wonderful man, and he helped me overcome my depression, and we became friends afterwards. And his father was in the mob. He controlled all the gambling in New York City for Frank Costello. And Frank Costello was Tom D'Amico's godfather in the religious sense. And Tom told me fascinating stories, that his parents were divorced. His father lived in the penthouse of the Sherry Netherland Hotel, and his mother was a seamstress, lived in his apartment in Brooklyn. And one day, his father and Frank Costello came to his high school, and they picked him up, and they drove him up to Saratoga to the races, and they gave him $1 to bet, and he lost it all, and he told me how badly he felt about it, because he could have given the money to his mother. And then when he graduated from high school, he asked if Frank Costello could arrange for him to go to the Copacabana with his prom date, and Frank Costello owned the Copacabana, arranged for Tom to have a free night. And what was interesting also is that because Tom knew so many of these people who were in the mob, he also got to treat a lot of sons of mobsters who were very conflicted about whether they wanted to go into the mob or not. And no strong desire to go in, but their fathers kind of encouraged them to, or opened the door for them to do it. And they weren't sure what they wanted to do. And so they would consult with him, and he would try to figure out a way for them to lead the kind of lives. Those are the things that got me interested in Bob in writing this book.
We have someone who asks, what is your next project?
I have a book coming out in February called Sin City Gangsters, The Rise and Decline of the Mob in Las Vegas. And I'm currently working on a book about the same topic regarding Hollywood. But there are a lot of mob groups, and there are a lot of Russians, and there are a lot of Albanians, Vietnamese. Compared to them, the Italians are very civilized.
Well, thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Steve.